People walk into my courtroom with their little stories, their rehearsed lines, and their misplaced sense of righteousness, and they genuinely believe that if they just project enough confidence, the truth will simply step aside. It's pathetic. Today's case was a textbook example of what happens when a person treats their responsibilities like optional accessories. The plaintiff, a woman named Miss Clara Vance, was suing her neighbor, Mr. Timothy Grant, for $2,000 in veterinary bills. She claimed Mr. Grant's dog, a massive, unruly German shepherd, had broken through a fence and attacked her small terrier, leaving the poor creature with a shattered leg and a mountain of medical debt. Mr. Grant, standing at the defendant's podium, was the kind of guy who thought wearing a polo shirt with the collar popped made him look like a gentleman. He didn't look like a gentleman. He looked like a man who spent more time grooming his ego than he did training his dog. "Mr. Grant," I said, my voice cutting through his attempt at a smug, relaxed posture, "don't you dare lean on that podium like you're at a tiki bar. This is a court of law. Stand up straight, look at me, and tell me, is it your dog that put Miss Vance's terrier in the veterinary hospital, or are we here today because you have a vivid imagination?" "Your Honor," he said, his voice dripping with that fake, condescending patience that makes my blood boil. "It's a terrible situation, I agree, but Miss Vance is blowing this out of proportion. My dog, Zeus, is a protector. He saw a squirrel, he got excited, and the fence? Well, the fence was old. It wasn't Zeus's fault that the neighbor's dog was in the wrong place at the wrong time." "Wrong place?" I repeated, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "The wrong place was her own backyard. Are you telling me that a dog in its own backyard is in the wrong place because your beast decided to treat her property like a buffet?" "Zeus didn't attack her dog," Grant insisted, his eyes darting toward the gallery for support he wasn't going to get. "He was just playing. He's a big dog, and he doesn't know his own strength. Miss Vance's dog is a tiny, neurotic thing that probably tripped over its own feet and broke its leg trying to run away. I shouldn't be held liable for a freak accident." I turned my gaze to Miss Vance. She was shaking, her eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. "Miss Vance, tell me exactly what you saw. And don't give me the Animal Kingdom version, mister. Grant is trying to sell me. I want the facts." "I was sitting on my porch, Judge," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "My terrier, Bella, was sniffing around the rose bushes. I heard a thud, and the next thing I knew, that dog, that massive German shepherd, was over the top of the fence. He didn't play. He grabbed Bella by the scruff and started shaking her like a toy. I was screaming. I was throwing cushions at them, and Mr. Grant was standing on his porch, just watching. He didn't even yell at his dog until the police siren started." I swiveled back to the defendant. "Mr. Grant, is she lying? Did you stand on your porch and watch your protector treat a smaller animal like a chew toy while the owner was screaming for help?" "I was in shock," he snapped, his facade starting to crumble. "I didn't know what to do. It all happened so fast. You can't blame me for being paralyzed by the situation. I can blame you for having a dangerous animal that you clearly have no control over," I said, leaning forward until I was right in his face. "If you own a large, powerful dog, you have a responsibility to ensure that animal is secure. You didn't secure the fence. You didn't train the dog. And from the sounds of it, you didn't even have the decency to act like a human being when the disaster you created finally happened." He started to argue, his face turning that blotchy, irritated red that usually signals a man who has never been told no in his life. "The fence was shared property. If it was so weak, she should have paid to fix it. She's just as responsible as I am." "Oh, it's her fault defense," I said, a dry, sharp laugh escaping my lips. How original. "Let me explain something to you, Mr. Grant. If you have a wrecking ball in your backyard, you don't blame the neighbor for not building a thicker wall to stop it from swinging into their house. You don't own the wrecking ball. You keep it contained. Your dog, your fence, your liability. Do you have a license for this animal?" He hesitated, a flicker of genuine panic crossing his eyes. I have the registration paperwork at home. Of course you do, I said, my voice thick with sarcasm. Right next to your gentleman's handbook and your responsible pet owner certificate, I'm sure. Miss Vance, do you have the veterinary report? The one that details the injuries? Yes, Judge, she said, handing a folder to my bailiff, Bird. I opened the folder. It was gruesome. Shattered bone, severe lacerations, the kind of damage that doesn't happen when a dog is playing. I looked up, my eyes locking onto Grant's. Mr. Grant, does this look like playing to you? Because I've seen some pretty violent games in my life, and this doesn't fit the description. This is an attack, and you are the one responsible for the cost of repairing the damage your protector caused. I am not paying $2,000 for her dog's recovery, he shouted, forgetting the room he was in. She's inflating the costs. She went to a boutique vet. She could have gone to the county clinic. She went to a vet who could save her dog's life. I corrected him, my voice rising. She didn't choose the boutique vet. She chose the vet who could put her pet back together after your animal tore it apart. And you are going to pay every single cent of that bill, plus court costs. You don't get to gamble with other people's property and then complain about the price of the repair. He stood there, mouth agape, the popped collar act having completely evaporated. He wasn't a gentleman, he wasn't a visionary, and he certainly wasn't a responsible owner. He was just a guy who got caught. And he was realizing that in my courtroom, being caught carries a very specific and very expensive penalty. I want a payment plan, he muttered, his voice defeated. You're not going to get a payment plan, I said, picking up my pen. You're going to pay it, and you're going to pay it now. If you have enough money to walk around with that leather jacket and that attitude, you have enough money to cover the medical costs of the tragedy you created. If not, I'm sure you can find some professional projects to finance it. Next time, try taking care of your dog instead of your ego. Payment plan, I scoffed, the words sounding like a bad joke I had heard 1,000 times before. I tapped my pen against the desk, the rhythmic, metallic sound echoing in the room, acting as a countdown to the reality check Mr. Grant was about to receive. Mr. Grant, you seem to be under the impression that my courtroom is a suggestion box where you can pick and choose how to satisfy a debt. Let me make this crystal clear. I do not deal in installments for people who can't take responsibility for their own animals. You pay the judgment in full, or you deal with the consequences of a court-mandated collection. He turned a shade of pale that I usually only see on people who have just been told their car has been impounded. He looked at Miss Vance, then back at me, searching for any scrap of sympathy and finding absolutely none. But I don't have that kind of liquidity. My assets are tied up in my business. Your business appears to be failing as spectacularly as your fence maintenance, I snapped, my eyes narrowing. You have the money for fancy collars and grooming supplies for a dog you can't control, but you don't have the money to pay for the medical care of the animal your dog nearly killed. That's a choice, Mr. Grant. That's a character flaw, not a lack of liquidity. I didn't wait for his pathetic rebuttal. I leaned toward the microphone, my voice dropping to that low, steady, and terrifyingly firm tone. Miss Vance, you've provided the receipts, the medical reports, and the photos. It's an open and shut case of negligence. Mr. Grant, you admit you are the owner of the animal. You admit the animal breached the fence, a fence that you were responsible for maintaining. And you admit that your dog was the aggressor in this situation. There is no playing. There is no accident. There is only the bill for your gross negligence. She's just out to get me, he suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of anger and desperation. She's been complaining about Zeus barking for months. She's been looking for an excuse to sue me. This is a setup. The courtroom erupted in a flurry of whispers. I didn't reach for my gavel, but I did let out a short, sharp breath that silenced the room instantly. Mr. Grant, I said, my voice dangerously calm, if you are suggesting that Miss Vance somehow enticed your dog to jump an entire fence tackle her pet, and sustain severe injuries just so she could get a check from you, then you are not just a bad dog owner, you are a delusional human being. Do you have any evidence of this setup, or are you just reaching for the nearest, most ridiculous lie to save your own skin? He opened his mouth, then closed it. He realized he had hit the ceiling of his own logic. He had no evidence, no proof, and no leg to stand on. He was just a man caught in his own web of excuses, and he was finally beginning to understand that the web had been burned away. I just meant, he started, his voice barely a murmur. You meant nothing, I interrupted. You meant to deflect, to deceive, and to walk away without paying your dues. It didn't work. The judgment is $2,000 plus court costs. You will pay it to the clerk, and the clerk will distribute it to Miss Vance. If you don't have it today, you'll have it by the end of the week, or you will find yourself in contempt of this court. And let me tell you, you do not want to be in contempt of this court. I have a very limited supply of patience, and you have officially exhausted it. He hung his head, looking like a man who had just lost everything, though in reality, he was just losing a fraction of what he truly deserved to lose. He turned toward the door, his popped collar looking sadder and more wilted than ever. Oh, and Mr. Grant? I added, just as he reached for the handle. He paused, looking back over his shoulder, his eyes wide and fearful. Do your neighbor a favor, I said, my voice smooth as glass. Before you buy another dog, go to the hardware store and buy a new fence, a tall one. And maybe, while you're there, buy a book on responsibility. It might be the best investment you ever make. He didn't respond. He just exited, the heavy door clicking shut with a finality that brought a sense of peace to the room. I turned my attention to Miss Vance. She was still standing there, looking like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, her relief not yet fully realized. Miss Vance, I said, my tone as gentle as I could manage, which is to say, still very businesslike. Your dog is going to be fine. You have your judgment. The law has worked exactly the way it's supposed to. Go home, take care of your pet, and never, ever hesitate to defend your property or your dignity again. You did good? She nodded, a genuine smile finally breaking through her exhaustion. Thank you, Judge. Thank you so much. I watched her walk out, the folder clutched to her chest. I didn't stay focused on her for long, though. My mind was already switching gears. The case was closed, the lesson was taught, and the courtroom was already resetting itself. Bird looked over at me, and I could see the hint of a smirk on his face. He's seen a lot of dogs in this room, but rarely one as poorly managed as Zeus, and rarely an owner as poorly managed as Timothy Grant. Another one down, Judge, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. They just don't learn, Bird, I replied, opening the next file, my eyes already scanning for the next lie. They think the world is built for their convenience. They think their dog, or their opinion, or their ego is a law unto itself. They're wrong. The law is the law, and I'm the one who makes sure they remember it. I looked down at the next folder, a dispute over a shared apartment lease and an unpaid utility bill. Predictable, boring, but I would dismantle it just as quickly and just as effectively. I straightened my robe, feeling the weight of the bench, the weight of truth, justice, and the uncompromising pursuit of what's right. I took a sip of water, cleared my throat, and looked toward the door. Bring them in. The next two characters walked in, and I didn't even need to hear them speak to know I was dealing with a classic case of the roommate from hell. They were a pair of 20-somethings, both dressed like they were auditioning for a commercial that required a lot of hand-waving and zero actual work. The plaintiff, a young woman named Chloe, was clutching a laptop bag like it was a shield. The defendant, a fellow named Justin, was wearing a hoodie that looked like it hadn't seen the inside of a washing machine since the previous administration. Sit, I commanded, my voice sharp enough to cut through the stale air. And Mr. Justin, take your hands out of your pockets. You aren't auditioning for a music video. You are here to answer for $3,000 in unpaid utilities and move-out damages. Start talking, And if you start with, but we were best friends, I am going to have Bird escort you out of my sight before you can finish the sentence. Justin blinked, clearly thrown off by the preemptive strike. Your Honor, this is all just a misunderstanding regarding the terms of our sublet. Chloe is— I don't care what Chloe is. I interrupted, my voice dropping to a low, rhythmic growl. I care about the bank statements and the signed lease addendum I have right here in front of me. You moved into this apartment. You agreed to cover 50% of the gas, electric, and internet, and you agreed to a security deposit. Did you pay it? Yes or no? I paid the deposit. But yes or no, Mr. Justin, I snapped. Did you pay the full amount of the utilities for the 6 months you resided there? Yes or no? He shifted his gaze darting to the floor. Not the full amount, no, but I didn't ask for the but, I said, leaning forward until I was glaring directly at him. I asked for the truth. You owe her $3,000. You admitted you didn't pay the utilities. What is your defense, other than I'm a deadbeat who thought I could live rent-free because I'm charismatic? I'm not a deadbeat, he shouted, his voice cracking. I lost my job. I was struggling to find work in the creative sector, and Chloe knew that. She said she'd cover for me until I got back on my feet. It was a verbal agreement between friends. A verbal agreement, I repeated, tasting the words like a bitter medicine. There it is, the battle cry of the incompetent. Chloe, is this verbal agreement in the room with us right now? Did you tell him he could live on your dime indefinitely while he pursued his creativity? Chloe looked at me, her expression a mix of exhaustion and vindication. Absolutely not, Judge. I told him he had 3 months to find a job, and after that, if he couldn't pay his share, he had to move out. He didn't move out. He stayed for 6 months. He didn't pay a cent, and he left the apartment with a hole in the wall and a carpet that had to be professionally cleaned because of his creative experiments with paint. I turned back to Justin. Paint? You were painting in a rental apartment? What? Were you the next Picasso? Or just someone who doesn't respect other people's property? I was doing a mural, he argued, his voice taking on that indignant, whiny pitch again. It was going to add value to the space. It was an investment in the ambiance. An investment, I scoffed, a dry, sharp sound. You destroyed a wall, you ruined a carpet, and you didn't pay for the electricity that allowed you to paint your little mural. That's not an investment, Mr. Justin. That's vandalism. And you are going to pay for every single penny of it. You don't understand the gig economy, he cried, his face turning a blotchy red. You're just looking at the bottom line. You aren't considering the cultural contribution of my work. I am looking at the bottom line because that is the only thing that matters in a court of law, I retorted, my voice rising in volume. I don't care about your cultural contribution. I care about the fact that you lived in a space you didn't pay for. You damaged property you didn't own, and you treated your friend like a personal bank. You are not a victim of the gig economy. You are a victim of your own laziness. I picked up the invoice from the cleaning company and the bill for the wall repair. It was exactly $3,000. I tossed the papers back onto the desk. Mr. Justin, you have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't enter a judgment against you right now. And if you say, but we were best friends, I am going to make sure your credit score is in the gutter for the next decade. He stood there, mouth agape, the realization finally dawning on him that his artistic charisma was having exactly zero effect on me. He looked at the cameras, then at Chloe, and finally, he slumped. I don't have the money, he whispered. I didn't ask if you had it, I said, my voice cold as ice. I asked why I shouldn't enter the judgment. If you don't have it, you'll earn it. You go get a job. You go work in a warehouse. You go flip burgers. You go do whatever you have to do to pay your debts, but you will pay her. And you will do it without another word of your cultural excuses. I grabbed my pen and signed the judgment. It was the only thing I could do, and it was the only thing that mattered. The truth was simple, the math was easy, and the liar was going to pay. Judgment for the plaintiff in the full amount. Get out of my courtroom. Bird didn't even have to move. Justin turned and slinked out of the room, his hoodie looking even more pathetic than before. Chloe stood there, a small, sad smile on her face. She'd lost a friend, but she gained back her dignity and her sanity. That's the only trade-off that matters in this room. Next, I said, not even waiting for the doors to close. I was already looking at the next file. The day was far from over, and I had plenty of justice left to serve. The next case file landed on my desk with a thud that felt entirely appropriate. This one was a dispute over a vintage designer handbag, $4,000, for a bag that the plaintiff claimed was a limited edition masterpiece and the defendant claimed was a glorified plastic and nylon knockoff. I flipped the folder open, and the photos were laughable. It was a bag that looked like it had been dragged through a hurricane, and these two women were standing in my courtroom acting like they were arguing over the crown jewels. "Miss Henderson?" I said, barely looking up from the documents. "You're suing Miss Lawson for $4,000 for a handbag." Let me guess, it's vintage, it's iconic, and it's completely falling apart at the seams. Am I in the right neighborhood? Miss Henderson, a woman who seemed to think that wearing a lot of gold jewelry was a substitute for a personality, bristled immediately. "Your Honor, that bag is a collector's item. It's a 1998 classic. I sold it to her in pristine condition. She's the one who ruined it by overstuffing it with heavy equipment and then had the audacity to demand a refund." "And you," I said, swiveling my gaze toward Miss Lawson, who looked like she hadn't smiled since the turn of the century. "You claim it's a fake? That it's a cheap imitation being passed off as the real deal?" "It is a fake, Judge," Lawson shouted, her voice shrill. "I took it to a professional authenticator, and the stitching alone proves it's a back alley counterfeit." She scammed me, and when I confronted her, she told me I didn't understand the market. I looked at the photos of the stitching. It was atrocious. A toddler with a sewing machine could have done a cleaner job. I set the photos down and stared at Henderson. "Miss Henderson, you're telling me this is a 1998 classic, and yet the logo on the inside tag is spelled with a typo. Are you a bad speller, or are you just a bad liar?" Henderson turned a shade of pink that perfectly matched her tacky blouse. That's just a manufacturing error. Some of the genuine items have those. It's part of the rarity." A manufacturing error on a luxury item? I let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that made the entire gallery jump. "You think these companies, who charge thousands of dollars for a piece of leather and some thread, just oops their way through a spelling mistake? You're trying to sell me a story, and the story is about as authentic as that bag." I turned to Lawson. "Miss Lawson, you spent $4,000 on a bag without getting it authenticated first? What were you thinking? You have the internet. You have authentication services. You were just begging to be taken for a ride, weren't you?" Lawson looked down, her face tight with embarrassment. "I trusted her, Judge. She's a member of my social circle. She told me it was a steal because she was liquidating her collection." "Trust," I said, shaking my head. "Trust is for family and people you've known for 20 years. When it comes to thousands of dollars, trust is the first thing you throw out the window. You didn't buy a bag, you bought a lesson in common sense, and the lesson cost you $4,000. I looked back at Henderson, whose eyes were darting around the room, desperately looking for an exit. "Miss Henderson, you knew it was a fake. You deliberately exploited your friend's ignorance to get rid of a piece of junk you probably bought for $50 at a street market. That's not liquidating a collection. That's fraud." "I did no such thing," she shrieked. "I'm a respectable woman." "A respectable woman doesn't sell knockoffs and lie about them to her social circle," I retorted, my voice ringing out with absolute authority. "I'm entering a judgment for the full amount of $4,000 against you, Miss Henderson. And since you're clearly not a fan of the truth, I'm also recommending that Miss Lawson file a report with the authorities regarding the sale of counterfeit goods. Let's see how much you enjoy explaining your manufacturing errors to an investigator." Henderson looked like she'd been struck by lightning. She opened her mouth to argue, but I slammed my gavel down. The sound was the only thing I needed to hear. Judgment entered. Get out of my sight, both of you. One of you is a scammer, and the other one is a fool. I don't know who I'm more annoyed with. As they hurried out, Henderson trying to salvage what was left of her ego, and Lawson looking like she just survived a shipwreck, I felt that familiar sense of order being restored. The air was clearer, the facts were settled, and the room was ready for the next layer of chaos. Next, I said, not even waiting for the door to stop rattling. Let's keep this moving. I have a long list of people who think they can lie to me, and I have every intention of proving them wrong before I head home. Bird leaned in. You're on a roll today, Judge. I'm not on a roll, Bird, I replied, opening the next folder. I'm just doing the math. I barely had time to adjust my robe before the next case file was in my hands. This one was a doozy. A dispute between a professional dog trainer and a client who claimed her poodle was traumatized by the training methods used. I looked at the file, then at the photo of the dog, a perfectly groomed, fluffy, and frankly bored-looking creature, and sighed. My patience for the "my pet is a person" crowd is non-existent. People project their own neuroses onto their animals, and then they go looking for someone to sue when the reality of pet ownership doesn't match their Instagram feed. Bring them in, I commanded, my voice sharp. The trainer, a burly guy named Rick who looked like he'd spent his life lifting weights and yelling at golden retrievers, marched in with his head held high. Behind him trailed the plaintiff, Mrs. Beatrice Higgins, who was clutching a silk handkerchief and looking like she was about to faint from the sheer emotional weight of the situation. Mrs. Higgins, I started not bothering with pleasantries. Let's skip the performance. You're suing Mr. Rick for $3,000. You claim he psychologically scarred your poodle during a 2-week boarding and training program. Let me see the medical report from the dog psychologist you consulted. She gasped, clutching her pearls. A psychologist, Your Honor. My poor Fifi hasn't been the same since she came home. She refuses to eat her organic kibble. She sits in the corner of the room staring at the wall. It's clearly the result of the harsh disciplinary methods he used. I turned my gaze to Rick. He looked like he was biting his tongue so hard it might bleed. Mr. Rick, did you traumatize this woman's poodle? Judge, he said, his voice flat, I taught the dog how to sit, stay, and not pee on the Persian rug. The dog is a poodle. She's spoiled, she's pampered, and she's used to getting her way. I didn't use harsh methods. I used consistent ones. This woman expects me to train a dog using positive reinforcement, but when I tried to give her the homework, she told me she didn't want to stifle the dog's personality. I looked at the notes in the file. Mrs. Higgins, did you refuse to follow the training program he provided for you to use at home? She flushed, her face turning a bright, defensive pink. That program was dehumanizing. He wanted me to use a crate. I told him my Fifi is not a caged animal. She is a princess. A princess, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. Well, your princess is currently costing you $3,000 because you couldn't handle the reality of owning an animal that needs structure. Mr. Rick, did you have a signed contract that stated the training methods you would use? Yes, Your Honor, right here. He handed a document to Bird, who brought it to my bench. I scanned it. It was a perfectly standard training contract with a clear section detailing the use of crates and positive discipline techniques. Mrs. Higgins had signed every single page. Mrs. Higgins, I said, pointing to her signature, you signed this. You agreed to the crate training. You agreed to the methods. You don't get to come into my courtroom and sue because you changed your mind and decided that your dog is royalty who doesn't need to follow the rules. But she was unhappy, she wailed. You could see it in her eyes. You see what you want to see, I snapped, leaning forward. This dog isn't traumatized. This dog is perfectly fine. You, on the other hand, are the one with the problem. You want to treat an animal like a human child. And when the dog refuses to act like a person, you blame the professional who actually tried to do the job you paid him for. Case dismissed. You owe him the remaining balance of the training fee, and if you don't pay it, I'll be happy to see you back here. She stared at me, completely stunned. But Fifi. Fifi is a dog, I said, tapping my gavel. Get a grip, buy a crate, and follow the instructions. Get out of my courtroom. Bird helped Mrs. Higgins toward the door, her silk handkerchief still fluttering in her hand. Rick stood there, looking relieved, before he turned and followed her out. Another one, Bird, I said, feeling that familiar, cold satisfaction. It's amazing what people will call trauma when they just don't want to admit they're lazy owners. They're a special breed, Judge Bird said, returning to his post. They certainly are, I replied, opening the next file. But they're not special enough to lie to me. Let's keep going.